Redfield Arts Audio.
Hello, this is Mark Redfield. Welcome to the program. So happy that you're here and listening. Our guest on the program today is Gary D. Rhodes, filmmaker, film historian, and author. And we're going to have a chat about all things vampires and all things movies. And I know that, it's interesting because specifically we'll be talking about vampires and the meaning of vampires in silent film. Gary has recently, in 2024, published a book, Vampires in the Silent Cinema, Edinburgh University Press. And I read it. It's a wonderful book. Gary loves fantasy film and specifically vampires. And this book is chock full of fascinating insight, and really it's kind of interesting how the vampire comes from literature, and the meaning of the word in the early 20th century really changes into something that we're very unfamiliar with today, and eventually refines its footing in the meaning as we know it today, particularly from the point of the Universal Dracula of 1931 with Bela Lugosi. But before we get to the interview, full disclosure, I've been friends with Gary for many, many years. Oklahoma, he has been born in Oklahoma. He's taught in Ireland. And of all places, when we made a connection and about film and film history and horror films and that kind of thing, I think the first time we actually met was in Manchester, England, many years ago. And I've worked with Gary several times since, did some minor narration on an animated film that he produced and directed based on Edgar Allan Poe's Ulalume. Did that along with Barbara Steele and Caroline Munro. And we produced the audio book of his novel, Oft, a delicious black comedy about a serial killer. So we continue to work together, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Gary D. Rhodes as we chat about all things vampires and movies.
Gary, it is always a pleasure to speak to you, and I have to tell you that I have read Vampires in Silent Cinema, and you had me at Vampires, you had me at Silent Cinema, passions of mine, which I'm sure I won't be able to shut up about as we talk about the book and talk about all of this stuff. I learned your books are wonderful. And I particularly like the string of books that you've done on the life and work of Bela Lugosi. There's a vampire thing going on beyond just a horror thing with you and me too. And, Vampires in Silent Cinema, I learned things, which I love. You filled in gaps between things that I may have suspected or intuitively felt, didn't really know. It's a marvelous, marvelous thing. So the first rookie question right out of the gate is, what was the seed? What prompted this particular book, this particular arc from, and none of this is spoiler. We talk about this all day long, but you do start with literature. You start with poetry, paintings, mythology, and it collides with early film. And so the search for the vampire, particularly in silent film into the 1920s, fascinating stuff. What lit the fuse for this book?
Well, Mark, thank you so very much. It's always a joy to talk with you. I think of the many years, intellectually, artistically, and certainly collegially, we've walked down a similar path together with our interests and our work. So it's always great to talk with you. in terms of silent vampires, I suppose what ignited the interest for me came when I was very young in the 1970s. I was born in 72, and by, I would say 77, 78, I was seeing some books, children's books, certainly, but they had photos of Nosferatu. You know, F.W. Murnau's, of course, Nosferatu from 1922, and they would have descriptions. I remember in a few of the children's books I read, 77, 1978, 79, through there were children's books that would also mention, in a sentence or two, Georges Méliès's The Devil's Castle from 1896, which was often, often talked about. It was considered a lost film at the time, but often talked about as the very first vampire film. And, you know, I think there's something about the archaic, you know, that calls to some of us. I think even from a young age, I think of Proust's old line, you know, how melancholy does one have to be to resuscitate Carthage? You know, to evoke those things long dead. But of course, I think for us, they're not dead, or they're certainly undead. You know, these images, these films, these vampires of decades now, more a century or more ago, that you know, they get their claws into us, and they don't let go, and we don't want to let go either.
I mean, absolutely. The vampire has a hypnotic something. Fans of vampire literature, movies certainly, and you know, just for fun. And I know we're going to do this because I know us. We are going to jump through the decades beyond the silent film era, quote unquote.
Wonderful.
But I'm curious about a couple of things, and the way your book progresses. So let's start at the very beginning. I loved the introduction that you got from the filmmaker. That, frankly, this is one of my last questions, but I'm gonna spoil it now. One of my favorite vampire films from, I think it's 2000, is Shadow of the Vampire. And
yes.
So tell the listeners who wrote the introduction and all the goodies behind that, because I love that.
Well, yes, thank you so much for noticing that, because, you know, there are filmmakers, and then there are filmmakers, you know, the ones that are at that reach that kind of plateau, you know, and I think Elias Mirage is one of the modern filmmakers, living filmmakers, that reaches that highest plateau that, at least in terms of music, Duke Ellington used to always talk about something fit for the, you know, kind of the highest level. And Mirage became quite, in his way, famous in the 1990s for an experimental feature film called Begotten, which is a silent film from the 1990s. It's a staggering, amazing, unforgettable film. It was experimental, so on the one hand, it was named, I think it was by Time Magazine, as one of the 10 best films of the year. On the other hand, of course, it wasn't a mainstream film, you know, with Jurassic Park or whatever else, you know, blockbusters. But Mirage had this insight. I think he makes what some of us would consider cinematic grimoires. He makes these. He's almost a kind of cinematic alchemist. And so this work of his that I'm talking about led to, I imagine it was Nicolas Cage, the famed actor, also producer of the film that you mentioned, one of my favorites too, Shadow of the Vampire, from the year 2000, who should direct this film, with John Malkovich playing Nosferatu's director, F.W. Murnau, of course, and Willem Dafoe playing Count Orlok, the vampire. This fantastical reimagining of the making of Nosferatu, in which the Orlok character is truly a real vampire. Max Schreck, the actor playing Orlok, he's a real vampire in this fantastical kind of alternate history. Nicolas Cage and others, of course, immediately went to the man we're speaking about, Elias Mirage. And Mirage's work, when I first saw Begotten, I think it's one of these moments where there's certain kind of imprints on our minds of cinematic images. And I couldn't stop. I still can't stop thinking about his film Begotten. He went on, of course, though, to make the film we're also talking about, Shadow of the Vampire. And so obviously at this point we are very far removed from silent cinema as a mainstream art form, at least. We are far removed from F.W. Murnau, Max Schreck, the people involved with, say, Nosferatu. We're far removed from the silent film era itself, which basically starts coming to an end in 1928-29. And yet there was Elias Mirage from Begotten, from Shadow of the Vampire, and he is a shadow of I think of the greatest of silent cinema, a shadow still casting long as a shadow in today's world. And so I was extremely pleased that he wrote the foreword to the book. Elias had attended an online conference that I co-chaired a couple of years ago, when it was the 100th anniversary, the centenary of Nosferatu in 2022. And he attended it and, of course, was like the great artists tend to be. You know, he was extremely kind and also extremely erudite in talking about Nosferatu, which inspired his most famous of films. He was the perfect person, I think, certainly in the 21st century, as we are so distant now from the original silent film era. He was the perfect person to write the foreword, and I remain, of course, deeply, deeply grateful he did.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's something that you reminded me of that is a phrase that I've long loved, and that's the kingdom of shadows, in referring to silent film and the power of just images.
Yes.
To tell stories. And
yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I think we're probably heading to the same place where, maybe some people, certainly I think Martin Scorsese has eloquently argued, rightly, that the image doesn't perhaps hold the same power that it once did, because if we go to a McDonald's, we see images on their menu that are more sophisticated than computer imagery was able to conjure in even as recently as the 1990s or the early 2000s. At a gas station pump, I'm assaulted by commercials on a screen, and so perhaps the image doesn't have the power it once did, and yet, of course, it has held that hypnotic capability. We mentioned Kingdom of Shadows, that, of course, being the tremendous article that Maxim Gorky wrote after seeing the Lumiere cinematograph in 1895. This incredible article of his. I think it's one of the greatest things ever written about the cinema of it's not life, but it's lifeless shadows. What he saw on the screen, because he saw black and white images. He saw life, but it was a shadow of it. And what more beautiful a metaphor for the likes of silent vampires or horror on screen in general, I think, than what he once gave in 1895.
I think so. And so we're not quite at 1922 yet. We're not quite at Nosferatu. And there's something else that has fascinated me forever that your book sort of fills gaps in with. And I'll be very general, and I'm going to jump through a lot of my art and literature and cinema history just to make a point that it seems to me, and you jump in and check me at any time in my little sketch here if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that, and let's just call it the popular audience, regardless of where we were as readers, how broad
Yes.
the readership was in any century. But it seems to me that the mythology of the vampire, the word vampire, had a very specific meaning in the 19th century. We knew it from mythology. The collective we knew that it was some sort of revenant. It was either something ghostly or something corporeal that drained life, drained blood. And in literature, the checklist goes, well, there's Polidori, but then there's Carmilla, and then there's, of course, Dracula, Stoker's Dracula.
Yes.
And bypassing the entire conversation of Stoker trying to stage Dracula as a play to get that into a wider audience than a readership, then there is this strange change that takes place, and this dovetails with the coming of cinema. So I'll now plug in a parallel lane in the highway that is movies. And I've always been fascinated with Lumiere brothers, William Friesgreen in England, and the very fact that movies were actualities. They were basically documents of things. And they weren't quite at narrative yet. And as they became, and of course Méliès, very much like French versions of English pantomimes, very presentational. And even into the early 1900s, the interesting thing is that monsters, with rare exceptions, and vampires specifically because of this conversation, don't appear. And two things, for the next 20-odd years and beyond, ghost stories are mostly going to be treated comically. So there are going to be some exceptions in the silent era when it becomes more narrative-like. Of course, Golem, we will get to Nosferatu in 1922. But then this is fascinating. And being a film fan all my life, and for those listeners who don't know, I'm going to name drop Theda Bara. The word vampire changes, and I learned some things in that strange cultural transition of what a vampire meant. Please take over, because I find this fascinating.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. I think I really love your phrase, strange cultural transition, because I think that's what it was. I think that you know, the term vampire was somewhat stable if we went back to the 16th, 17th, 18th century and into the 19th, you know, the folkloric vampire that you described. If the folkloric vampire changes in the 19th century with the appropriate lineage you give, meaning, you know, John Polidori, Varney the Vampire, Carmilla, Stoker with Dracula in 1897. If the folkloric vampire changes, it's really just that he or she becomes more attractive physically, you know, rather than being a rotting corpse out of a dirty grave. You know, they become kind of like the sexy vampire we think of, you know, that Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, so many wonderful actresses that Hammer and so forth would portray, you know. But that was still the supernatural vampire. They were just maybe a bit better looking, you know, and more alluring. But then this bizarre thing starts happening in the 1890s, you know, and it's really bizarre. Because if you had asked somebody, and I think we could actually say a year like 1896, if you had asked somebody what a vampire was in America, in Europe, they would have said what we now think a vampire, a bloodsucker, the undead, back from the grave. If they said a second or you know, a thing, they would have mentioned the vampire bat, which had become much discussed in the press of the second half of the 19th century in America and Europe, and not uncommon at some zoos, some carnivals, you know, a vampire bat that had been caught somewhere in the world and then on display.
You know, and I'll bet, I don't know this for a fact, but I will bet that even someone like P.T. Barnum in his museum in New York may have had something like that.
Oh, yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think this was the living proof of a folkloric character, or at least something close to it, that here is an actual bat. It does want blood. It's akin to the folkloric supernatural character that during the 19th century, yes, becomes maybe more alluring physically, even aristocratic, from Lord Ruthven and Polidori through Count, as he is Count Dracula in Stoker. But then we hit 1897, and although there's a few earlier roots, they're fairly obscure. I think in 1897, what really gets kind of a bit of a hiccup or a change, or, the dictionary definition that has to have the second or third definition in something like the Oxford English Dictionary, the vampire becomes multivalent. In addition to the folkloric supernatural character, in addition to the bat, the vampire becomes something else, something extra. And that is thanks to both Philip Burne-Jones in an 1897 painting called The Vampire, and thanks to his cousin, Rudyard Kipling, who wrote a companion poem, A Fool There Was, Even As You and I, a companion poem called The Vampire. The vampire becomes much more clearly, with the word vampire, a metaphor.
The vampire. A fool there was, and he made his prayer, even as you and I, to a rag and a bone and a hank of hair. We called her the woman who did not care, but the fool he called her his lady fair, even as you and I. Oh, the years we waste, and the tears we waste, and the work of our head and hand belonged to the woman who did not know, and now we know that she never could know and did not understand. A fool there was, and his goods he spent, even as you and I. Honor and faith and a sure intent, and it wasn't the least what the lady meant, but a fool must follow his natural bent, even as you and I. Oh, the toil we lost, and the spoil we lost, and the excellent things we planned belonged to the woman who didn't know why, and now we know that she never knew why, and did not understand. The fool was stripped to his foolish hide, even as you and I, which she might have seen when she threw him aside. But it isn't on record, the lady tried. So some of him lived, but the most of him died, even as you and I. And it isn't the shame, and it isn't the blame that stings like a white-hot brand. It's coming to know that she never knew why, seeing at last she could never know why, and never could understand.
And it becomes a metaphor for, in the case of Burne-Jones and Kipling, specifically, it becomes a metaphor for a woman, a very real, corporeal, natural woman. Human woman. Yes, human woman, yes, who drains a man of his lifeblood, whether that means his spirit, emotions, his sexuality, and certainly his financial capabilities, his bankroll. This is what the painting, Burne-Jones painting, is about. Is a woman kind of leaning over a man after having drawn out of him his lifeblood, for all that might mean. And that's Kipling's poem too. A fool there was, even as you and I. The phrase leading to the Theda Bara film famously the Fox film of the silent era, called A Fool There Was. So all of a sudden you have this cultural moment. It's kind of like one of these fads, one of these things where a term, a word changes. When I was a little kid, net meant something you might go fishing with or catch a butterfly in. By the late 90s, it of course meant the internet equally, if not much more so. And I think that's something that happened in the fin de siècle of the 19th century, is all of a sudden the word vampire starts to mean more prominently than its origin, the supernatural folkloric origin. It starts to mean somebody, usually a woman, somebody who feeds off of another person metaphorically. And this starts to show up in the theater. By 1908, there is a stage adaptation on Broadway called A Fool There Was. It starts to show up in films, 1908 to 1910 and beyond, most famously with Theda Bara. And this character, this kind of metaphorical vampire, bore some commonality to the supernatural, including in that she often wore dark makeup. She sometimes had kind of a funereal gown on, grave-like. Theda Bara herself was posed in publicity pictures with, literally on top of male skeletons and so forth, or with bats, or artistically drawn bats. So there is the allusion there to the supernatural. But with these women and also men, because there was, if Theda Bara became the vamp, as the term was shortened, there were also he-vamps, as they were called in the 1910s. Lou Cody, the film actor, now forgotten, but he was the most famous at the time of these he-vamps that did the same thing with innocent young women, drained them of what he wanted and threw them away. Some of these characters, particularly some of the women like Theda Bara, and there were a number of other actresses too, sometimes they would even appear in makeup that would be not all that far from what in the late 20th century and now we would call goth makeup. Exactly. But these were metaphorical vampires. And so one of my favorite things I've ever found in my research is an article from around the turn of the 20th century, and it's a journalist who is befuddled because he's met a couple of younger women, and they only associate the term vampire with this Rudyard Kipling type character, this Theda Bara character.
Femme fatale type.
This femme fatale type that we would show, this prototype of that, these kind of characters. I mean, we could think of even like the likes of Anne Savage, her character in Edgar Ulmer's Detour, the femme fatale, in other words, of film noirs. Yeah, we could spin forward if we wanted in time to the likes of Sharon Stone and Basic Instinct or something. These kind of characters. They only could see that. That's all they understood. And this journalist that I found is befuddled because he's aware, of course, of the Bram Stoker and the folkloric vampire. And so there is this fissure. And I think that, I hope that's a good word for it, because it's not altogether a split. These aren't two different things. They bear some commonalities.
It is a strange flip. It is these young people today, I tell you.
Yes.
They don't know from vampires. But it is a weird blip, isn't it? Because it really, in film, it does bleed into the 1920s, very close to the sound era. And then, yes, as I'm groping, it could morph into the other popular type, the femme fatale from the noir films of the 40s and beyond. And but so what is, so again, I'm just going to let's talk photochemical film. From the very first frame, let's just say 1895 to Nosferatu in 1922, essentially the largest portion of the so-called silent era. What vampires, what real vampires?
Yeah.
What mythological, what monsters vampiric monsters are appearing on film. What's happening?
Well, this is fascinating because there's actually very few. With all of the prominence, the unforgettable influence, the unforgettable qualities of Nosferatu in 1922, that we still, obviously, we are right now talking about today. With all of what Nosferatu is in 1922 and beyond, there actually is quantitatively very few supernatural vampires on the silent screen.
Yeah.
The largest number are of two other types, and one of them we've been just talking about, which is this femme fatale, this theta bara, this vamp, right? Which even came to be a verb, in the 1910s and 20s. She vamped me,
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. The other meaning, which had 19th century roots, was also metaphorical, which was to use the word vampire as somebody who feeds off of somebody else, but not maybe emotionally or romantically, but more financially in terms of being a criminal. And we can find this in the early 19th century. It keeps getting stronger as a metaphor in the late 19th century, and certainly the most famous example in the silent film era would be Les Vampires, the silent film serial.
Yeah,
in which a criminal gang, and they do dress in black, and they do have a bit of goth makeup, at least certainly the leader of the gang, but they're criminals, and this actually shows up in that was a French serial, but it also shows up in America by 1926 on screen with the likes of Roland West's film The Bat.
Right.
And, he's a criminal, he's a master criminal, breaking into homes, stealing jewels and so forth, but he adorns himself as a bat. So you've got these metaphors, and they're all over the place, and not just in America, but in other countries. When it comes, though, to your real question about real vampires, which is what we really care about, most of all, at least, there's not that many. There's really very few, and Nosferatu remains the most famous for all kinds of good reasons. But one of them would be that he's in relatively small company during those initial decades of American cinema. I can talk about a few of the others if you like.
Oh, absolutely. Love it, because I'm trying to remember and work chronologically through your book and chronologically through history to hopefully whet the listener's appetite, and because once we get to Nosferatu, that's going to open up, and I just would love to spend a few minutes into the 20th century up until now. Films that we're anticipating in the near future. I think my final formal question that I will ask in a little bit will be, I want us to compare notes about our favorite vampire movies of all time. So,
wonderful, yes.
Let's continue more or less chronologically before we start jumping all over.
Well, I think, for me, one of the fascinating things about the silent film era is how few supernatural vampires are there, and how some of them that we have talked about in the later 20th century, and even to the present day, probably aren't really supernatural vampires. If we go back to our earlier discussion of Georges Méliès, which some listeners may know him as much for Martin Scorsese's film Hugo, of course, wonderfully with Sir Ben Kingsley playing Méliès.
Oh, yeah, and the image from A Trip to the Moon from 1912.
Of course, the lunar lander smacking into, piercing the face of the man in the moon, who goes from happy to sad, understandably, as a result. Méliès, Méliès, Scorsese, it doesn't need to be Scorsese, though it's probably all of us, probably you and me. I mean, when I saw A Trip to the Moon from 1902, when I was about, say, 13, maybe 14, till now, it's just, Méliès' works are unforgettable, I think, and he was the first real horror sci-fi filmmaker and the first great special effects artist. But the curious thing, Mark, is he wasn't the first vampire filmmaker, because if we go back to that 1896 film we've already mentioned, which in English we normally call, back to when it was first shown in America in the 19th century, we would call it The Devil's Castle, Le Manoir du Diable. We would say, you know, in the French, the original. It does show a person who changes from bat to human form in a castle and conjures various ghosts, witches, demons, and then is dispelled by by a cross. And that caused people, even before the film was rediscovered, that caused some writers by the 1960s and 70s to say, well, he's a bat, he's scared of the cross, he must be a vampire. Well, what I try to show in my book is that's actually not the case, nor would it be how anybody would have understood it in 1896. By contrast, there is an inordinate body of literature, including dating to the Holy Bible, that shows Satan and his minions being winged, being bat-like. Satan is in the Bible, I think, you know, the Lord of the skies he's referred to, as well as the Lord of the flies, but the Lord of the skies, the air. At one point, there's, you know, through Dante's Inferno and so forth, there's that image, and the cross being used to dispel Satan, which we can relate to even in the modern period with the likes of, say, William Friedkin's The Exorcist. So Méliès's film is fascinating in that it looks to our eyes looking backwards, maybe like a vampire, but it wouldn't have been understood it that way at the time, nor was that the intention. He's a devil, just like the title of the film suggests, The Devil's Castle.
Yes.
So then what do we get? Well, we get a few curious films from then on, meaning from the earliest days of the 20th century until Nosferatu. We get a few films that might qualify. We get a film from 1905 called Loie Fuller, which this is actually the photo that's on the cover of my book. It's a film frame from Loie Fuller of 1905, Pathé Frère, a French film. And it stars somebody who's pretending to be Loie Fuller, who was a famous dancer at the time. And she changes from bat form to human and does an exotic dance. And it very much resembles the kind of supernatural vampire dances that were popular in the late 19th century. We get a couple of films of the vamp type that came close to trying to resemble the vampire. So like as close as you could get a tight wire act between the likes of, say, a Theda Bara and a Bram Stoker all at once. One of the most notable would be a Danish film from 1912 that still exists, and a couple of dancers perform a vampire dance on stage. This is within the film, and she is meant to be supernatural. She even bites her victim, this female vampire dancer, and he dies, and it's probably the first vampire bite, you know.
Oh,
but,
wow.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. I'm actually in the works of restoring this film now. Thankfully, 2 copies survive, and by 2025 we'll have this restored for people to see. And you know, firsts are what they are. You know, they're kind of interesting. Who was the first person at the North Pole, or to land on the moon, set foot on the moon, etc. When was the first vampire bite? It seems to have happened on screen in 1912. Wow. But the last film, this stuff's wonderful. The last film I'll share with you, though, the last one that's really worth mentioning before we hit Nosferatu, is a Russian film from 1915 in which a young wife dies. In the film, it translates to English as The Afterlife Wanderer. And this 1915 film... Yeah, it's a wonderful title. There's about 5 tremendous images that still exist from the film, though the film itself proper is lost. And she comes back to life. One of the stills actually shows the coffin lid coming off of the coffin, seemingly by its own accord, supernaturally. in a way that happens in Nosferatu, where the lid removes itself, presumably at the behest of the vampire. She comes back to life and she starts feeding off of blood. And she seems to be really the first real vampire in the cinema. So this is the Russian film Afterlife Wanderer from 1915. I've got a YouTube video about that film out now. And of all wonderful things, some listeners will know the actress who played her, believe it or not, because she was young at the time, but the actress who played the first really true vampire on the screen. The actress left Russia and ended up in Hollywood, and including in starring in Todd Browning's film Freaks in 1932. It was Olga Baklanova.
Wow.
And this wonderful, fantastic, beautiful actress, tremendous. When she was quite young, she was the Afterlife Wanderer in 1915. And so some of my favorite things about the book, and I worked with a few tremendous scholars of Russian cinema, a couple of them Russian, a couple of them American, but who work in that field, where there was all of this extensive work to dredge up all that's possible about this first really, really true vampire film.
That's just marvelous. But again, I just will double down in my astounded, gobsmacked disbelief that of all of that literature, all of that folklore and mythology, that through this period, through all of these years, you've got filmmakers all over the world not really quite getting to the vampire thing yet. Because if the most prolific filmmaker with monsters was Georges Méliès, and because, my God, there's the Moon Men, the Selenites in Trip to the Moon, and I know I said 1912, I meant 1902. Thank you. But he did Abominable Snowmen, he did Devils, he did Witches, he did Dancing Severed Heads. So he was doing so much in fantasy, and it's just amazing to me that it isn't really until a completely unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel in Germany, with Nosferatu in 1922. Do we really get a vampire?
Yeah, and it is fascinating. And we get the Russian film from 1915 I mentioned, which had very little impact. There was an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula in Hungary in 1921. But very few people see it, and even the few who do don't seem to watch it until 1923. No, I mean, if you really want a brass tacks cut through so much of the book I wrote, you could basically say Count Orlok, Graf Orlok, in F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, as played by Max Schreck. This is the first major vampire on the screen. And that's fascinating because it comes over 25 years after the advent of cinema.
And that just stuns me, because you've got the cinema playing with almost embarking on every genre that we still play within today. Essentially the fantasy film, Griffith with the gangster film. You can trace once they move into narrative. And not talking about comedies, not talking about, and even ghost films don't get serious for a very long time, because even in the teens, Buster Keaton will make a film called The Haunted House, and it's a comedy. Ghosts aren't real, or if they're real, they're comic.
Yes.
So that's just kind of amazing to me. And in the other arts, we are going experimental. We're going Gothic, we're going in music, in the theater, particularly before the Nazis in Germany. There was so much experimentation. The other day on the phone, I had mentioned to you the noodling around the idea of Bertolt Brecht and his experimental film from about the time that Nosferatu, 1922, 23, after Nosferatu, and the fact that he worked with Max Schreck. that Shrek is in this experimental film that he didn't write a script for, he outlined, which was the script for this thing.
Yes.
Called The Fabulous Barber Shop or something. But anyway, all of that aside, do you, just to get personal for a moment, do you remember when you first saw Nosferatu, Murnau?
Yes, I do. I remember two things. I remember when I first saw a photograph from it, which was in a children's book about horror films that my eldest sister had bought at a school book fair. It was, I think his name was Edward Edelson, did this children's book in the mid 1970s, and it had the photograph film frame of Orlok looking basically into the camera as he's looming over Ellen, the female victim in the film, of course, near the end of the film, and it was just this haunting image that I still can't escape. So I remember that very clearly. I was probably 4 to 5 years old when I first saw Orlok. When I first saw the film, that was thanks to VHS, which was such a boon to all of us as film lovers. I think it was probably something like 1984 to 85, and I was 12 or 13. And I watched it. I watched it twice in a row on a Friday night, laying in my parents' living room floor. And they were asleep, and my sisters were either out. One of them was by that time in college and away from home, and so it was just me there, laying in the floor with a pillow, and I was so entranced by Nosferatu that, of course, that as I said, I watched it a second time that same night. And so many images we could talk about being so powerful, including, of course, when he fully erect, his body not moving with this incredible posture. He just stands straight up out of the coffin, which is the kind of thing, you can only experience when you watch it, even though I had seen still photographs, meaning the film frames. Certain aspects of film, movies are moving pictures, of course. We have to, they're time-based. We have to, we need, in the best case at least, to be able to watch the footage unfold. And Nosferatu standing upright, erect, Nosferatu fading into nothingness at the climax of the film with the sunlight hitting him. Those kinds of images, they grip me as tight as any vampire's claws, probably. Wow.
And I'm curious, Gary, had you already seen, because I know your love of Lugosi and the 31 Dracula, had you already seen the Universal Dracula?
Yes, I had. Thanks. Yeah, I'd seen it. I would seen it when I was around probably 5 or 6. And then I had seen it again when I was around 11 or 12. And in the interim, I'd also seen Lugosi playing Dracula in Abbott and Costello and a few other film iterations, including one that I love. And I saw a great photograph of you with Michael Nuri once, you two together, who he played, I'm recalling, he played Dracula in the Cliffhangers TV show. From around 77 or 78, which I also saw as a kid. So I was familiar with Lugosi, but also other actors playing Dracula, as well as cartoons even from the 1970s, these kind of cartoon adaptations. So I'd seen various Draculas, but Orlok, I think, stood apart for a lot of reasons. One, that it was a silent film, and in the best of senses of that, it was a silent film benefiting from the lack of audio, a soundtrack, but also just, he's so dramatically different than this kind of, whether we want to ascribe it, and I think we can ascribe it to Polidori and Stoker, or whether we want to ascribe it to later in the 20th century to Lugosi and Browning, or Terence Fisher and Christopher Lee, or so forth. This more, well-dressed, tuxedo-wearing vampire, royal aristocratic background, etc., versus the just this monstrous qualities of Orlok, and long talked about, of course, but this kind of both bat-like and rat-like features, this, in Browning's Dracula that you mentioned with Lugosi, we see vermin in Dracula's castle in the basement, but Dracula himself is still wearing a tuxedo. In Nosferatu, Orlok is the vermin. He is the nocturnal creature, with his bat-like ears and his fangs and his claws, and he seems barely human. He seems more monster than human, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And we would be remiss to completely leave talking about your book and talking about going just straight for vampire movies. But it is important to talk about, and you know what a Lon Chaney fan I am.
Of course.
Remiss of us not to mention London After Midnight. Oh, by the way, before I forget, and for listeners, it is still I don't have a good recommendation. It is still very difficult, I think, to find a really good DVD or Blu-ray of Murnau's Nosferatu. There have been so many different versions with different soundtracks. The worst are, of course, just blind needle drop music tracks that don't think of anything. You'll be getting the film possibly in the wrong speed. So you have to really do your due diligence and look at some good reviews about what companies sell the better versions. But let's talk about, am I right? 1927, London After Midnight.
Yes. Well, this is fascinating because, we know that both in 1915 and in 1925, Universal Pictures, in both of those years, considered making Bram Stoker's Dracula into a feature film. And in both cases, of course, they didn't do it. And we actually have a letter that Carl Laemmle Sr. wrote, the founder of Universal, saying in the 1920s, well, it's probably too gruesome to really transfer to the screen. And so it's fascinating, in other words, that with all of Universal's connection to monsters and to Dracula, and they still, of course, rightly speak about that heritage cinematically, it's curious that they're not the ones who introduced the vampire to American feature film. It's MGM with Todd Browning and Lon Chaney. And of course, London After Midnight's so enigmatical because it's a lost film. So all we have to go on are publicity stills and a very small number of film frames that have been rediscovered in the 21st century, but no footage itself, And so all we have to go on is, we know the story, the script's been reprinted, etc. We've got these photos, these rather incredible photos showing Chaney as a vampire that's not particularly alluring physically. It's not a handsome man or woman. It's more of a ghastly character with jagged teeth, top hat, hunched over, kind of wild hair. I think we wonderfully see a reincarnation of his character in the 21st century film, relatively recent film called The Babadook. And so we get this first American vampire film, and of course vampires, I think, are by their nature paradoxical because they're not alive or dead, they're undead. And what does that mean? I mean, it is a paradox. They're moving around, but they're not alive, but they're also not dead, and so forth. Well, the paradox of London After Midnight is that it's the first American vampire feature film, but there's no real vampire in it because it turns out. At the end, it turns out, spoiler alert, but nobody can watch the film, alas. It turns out that the vampire in the film, as well as his female vampire friend, they're not real vampires. They're just people putting on makeup as part of an effort to guilt, to freak out a murderer into confessing his crime, his murder. Right. And so it's a fascinating thing. It's part of this kind of weird evolution of the vampire and silent cinema that somehow is strange, maybe a little disappointing, but also somehow very wonderful that the first Hollywood vampire isn't a vampire. He's somebody pretending to be.
I love that about that. I love that paradox about it. I'm, as you know, an enormous Lon Chaney fan. That makeup is as stunning as everything. The costume is interesting to me. It's part Deco, part German Expressionism. So it's not necessarily anything American or British, and it certainly isn't the aristocrat that comes out of the play that the Universal Dracula is based on. But hope springs eternal, that it's in a salt mine collection somewhere, it's in an attic, it's in the Cinematheque in France, it's in some...
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love what you're saying, Mark, because we're both, I think, optimistic. London After Midnight's lost, but what's lost is sometimes found. Méliès's Devil's Castle wasn't rediscovered until around the turn of the 21st century, and it was thought lost for decades, and it was found not in France or even America, but in New Zealand. I think, we are guarded, rightly, in our optimism about London After Midnight, but it's not impossible it could resurface. We've seen just in the past year that the silent film version of a horror comedy called The Gorilla has been rediscovered in Europe.
Yeah.
And so these kinds of rediscoveries, we can't bank on them. We might not bet short odds on them, but they do happen. And so hope, as you say, springs eternal. I love that phrase.
Well, this is the only time you're ever going to hear me say what I'm about to say, particularly in 2024 and moving forward. But perhaps, thank God for film piracy, because one of the reasons, whether it's because we know and hardcore film lovers know that how much film has been lost because of it being shot on nitrate stock that either burned up or just disintegrated or wasn't cared for. And we also know that for years, Hollywood just the American film have not been preserving and taking care of the photochemical films. Now we're finding out that, oops, we better do something about everything that's been created in post-production and held in electronic storage, because that's not forever either. So that's the only time you're going to hear me say, thank God for some film piracy. That's why a film might still be rediscovered.
Absolutely. I truly agree on this count. I mean, we all know probably the famous story that a court in Germany condemned Nosferatu, all copies to be burned, to be destroyed. Right. Copies, of course, survive. Some of them weren't legal copies. In fact, if there's any wonderful, ironic justice in the universe of film vampires and horror, there is the funny thing I learned doing my book, which is, of course, Nosferatu was condemned to be destroyed, and of course it still survives. However, hilariously, the court documents where the judge condemned it to be destroyed, those are now lost. Those don't survive.
Yeah.
So the papers writing the death sentence don't survive, but the one sentenced to death, our buddy Count Orlok, of course, lives in the original form as well as in remakes, including one coming to theaters near us this December, thanks to Robert Eggers, and yet another remake.
And I cannot wait to see this. So this is perfect segue. Folks, I highly recommend, if you love silent films, and if you're a horror fan, and if particularly you're a vampire fan, Vampires in the Silent Cinema by Gary D. Rhodes. Check it out. Find it on Amazon. Just do a search on Amazon. You'll find out where you can get it. And so this leads me to the question that might lead to another 3 hours, but nope. I'm going to exert some willpower so we can pick this up again, because I do want to do another chat with you in the very near future because of your novel, Oft, which I'm grateful to have done the audiobook narration for. And so we'll be talking again, and I'm sure this so much more to talk about movies. So I'm just going to leave. We're just going to sort of get out of this podcast with this question, and let's both share. Let me just leave 4 or 5. What are your favorite vampire films ever? Not just of any particular era, or what can you just throw on at any time because you just so enjoy them?
Well,
or
the first
like
3,
me,
yes.
have that extra critical. This is why I love them. So let me.
Yeah, well, the first 3 are easy for me to say, and that would be Murnau's Nosferatu, Todd Browning's Dracula, and Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire. Those 3 I'll never escape them, and I never ever want to. Those would be the top 3. There's so many others that it would be tough to I'd go for placement 4 and 5. I'd go fighting over everything from, say, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave to even that section of cliffhangers we talked about, which I loved as a kid, to even freaky, wonderful things like Vampire's Kiss with Nicolas Cage. But that's me fighting with that's shadow boxing with myself about what maybe would be 4 and 5. But those first 3, they'll always be the first 3 for me.
Yeah, I see. This is tough for me because I thought about this when we decided to chat about all this, and I was just curious because, I love the fantasy genre, and I use the word fantasy. I'll lump in science fiction because there's so little in film that is true science fiction. It tends to lean toward fantasy or action adventure, and horror. I'm not what is known as a contemporary horror guy, which I guess what I mean is more the gore kind of thing. I lean toward fantasy films.
Yes.
For me, and this is where you promise that we stay friends no matter what.
Please.
In no particular order, in my top 5 is not Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula. It's not in my top 4. And I don't know why. One of the things that you said that so fascinated me was how old you were when you watched Nosferatu, and it was a silent film. And the very fact that, I think it's like language. I think it's like reading to children. I think it's true that if you read to a child when they're in single digits, the love of books, the love of literature, the fact that they may go on to read, I think that is the best time. And then it opens them up to become readers. I think it's the same thing with film. And if you come to silent film very late and I don't know what this means, but I'm going to say it anyway, if you see the wrong silent film as your first one, if that's your first experience, your first date with a film that it's just not in your wheelhouse. Some people think Chaplin is hilarious. Some people prefer Buster Keaton. As far as film fantasy, it's an odd thing. But the very fact that you did that on your own, watched it twice, is remarkable for me, by the way. I'm slightly older than you are, so I was in the 3rd grade. We were living in Wisconsin. My father was taking me to film festivals on campus where he taught.
Wonderful.
And I remember on PBS watching the Lon Chaney Hunchback first. And that's the first time I ever saw Chaney. And it had, for my memory, it was a billion years ago, but I don't remember being taken out of it by the music or anything. I was mesmerized. And so we left it on, and soon, not that same night, but soon after that, Nosferatu on that PBS station.
Wonderful.
It was that early. It was early for me, too. So in no particular order, having gotten saved our friendship, because I'll just look.
It'll never die.
In really no particular order, The Night Stalker from 1972.
Oh, yes, of course, Kolchak, yeah.
Yeah, that had such an impact on me. I saw that on broadcast in 72. It's a remarkable thing. And as fellow filmmakers, I mean, my God, making a under 80-minute feature film in 12 days, which is what TV used to do. Quite remarkable, and
Very.
based on an unpublished novel by Jeff Rice. And the thing of it is that there's going to be a theme in my favorite vampire movies, is that they're all really nasty, and you don't get any nastier than this vampire that has no dialogue and is a force, is maybe costumed a bit theatrically in that he's in a dark suit,
Yes.
in Las Vegas in the 70s. And then quickly, I'll just blow through these. We talked about this, earlier. And it's because of Willem Dafoe. I think Shadow of the Vampire is one of my favorites because Willem is one of my favorite vampires.
Oh, yes.
And I love Shrek's performance in 22, Nosferatu. I love Klaus Kinski in Herzog's 1979 Nosferatu. I'm very much looking for Skarsgård in this new one we're getting in 2024.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to throw Shadow of the Vampire because of Willem Dafoe's, and I love movies.
Wonderful. No, and it is a vampire film that's about vampirism in so many ways, beyond even Defoe, although he's sublime. So no, I agree. I think it's tremendous.
And of course, I probably meant to say this if I'm repeating, but the 22 Nosferatu. But you know what? I'm going to anticipate. I'm literally going to put both Herzog's and Murnau's. They're vastly different in tone, in feel, also depending on the music one experiences Nosferatu with for the first time. But they're both marvelous, and so I've lost count. But I'm going to of very recent vampire films. I have to include the '58 Dracula with Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing. Which is the second of the Hammer horrors that launched Hammer Films into their color Gothic horror. I absolutely adore that script. It is, just to me, it just decides to take what it takes, cuts whacking parts. It jettisons the novel, really. It's a marvelous. I don't know how to compare it to anything else that may have been derived from that. And I'm talking about the Balderston play that the Lugosi is based on. Also the Langella is extracted from that play as much as any film. And I just really like that adaptation. I like its contraction of action. Everything being, so there's something marvelous about it. And I am a big Christopher Lee fan in the character. And that's a whole hour to talk about Lee's Dracula, and he only had 5 lines of dialogue in his life as the character. And that doesn't include the Jess Franco. And then I mean, look, I think all of those are just tremendous. And of course, it's interesting as I think about you mentioning some of these films that either they are or they are about silent vampires, all of them really, because of course Christopher Lee, the lack of dialogue in the original horror of Dracula, as we call it in America, as opposed to some of his later films, that these are vampires who are kind of mum, even sometimes when the films have dialogue. And, in Stoker's novel, Dracula doesn't say that much.
No, that's true. And Lugosi would sometimes talk about the relatively limited number of sides in the Dean Balderston play, the famous Broadway play, so.
Right. And I'm just going to throw a couple of other titles to break because there's some that just, as vampire films, I love, and they're all eclectic and Near Dark.
Wonderful, yes.
And I don't love it, but I like it a lot because I like the story and the concept. But the film that's based on the Stephen King Night Flyer, the concept of the vampire flying around in a little Piper airplane in between sunrise and sun. I mean, there's something so marvelous about that concept and then calling it Night Flyer. And the film is okay. I like the film, but I have to mention this as my final, and I know I've gone over 5. But Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass.
Tremendous! I adore it too. I really do.
When I saw it, I swallowed it whole, and I quickly realized it's in my top 10 vampire films. And the funny thing about that is, I may have told you this before, I don't know. Years and years ago, Mike and I were with a group of friends. We were at Disneyland. And I remember sitting on a bench on Main Street. We'd just talk, the whole day. I think we were there for a friend's birthday, and he had never been to the park, and so chit-chatting and doing. And I remember sitting on a bench, and I had started with my off-time writing partner, Stuart Voitillo, working on our novels, our Vampire Hunters Incorporated series. And he said, well, I'm grappling with this idea about a vampire priest. And it stuck with me, and I forgot about it until it got close to Midnight Mass being released on Netflix. And I think it does everything that Mike does so very well, and does something fresh with, again, a purely evil entity, a purely evil vampire.
Yes. Which of course takes us back to Orlok, I think,
because
that totally evil vampire rather than one with some semblance of sympathy we could feel for him or her, or that they're alluring or something like that. No, I think Orlok, Midnight Mass, there's some of these where they're just truly the epitome of evil.
Oh, over 100 years there's an absolute direct bloodline, if you will. Forgive me for the pun, but there's a direct thing. And, I'm not a hard critic. I'm an easy audience, but I've never really liked the romantic vampire very much. We can read that into Lugosi. We can read that into Christopher Lee. It really surfaces, I think, with 2 things, and it's Dan Curtis. Not that Dan Curtis is 2 things, but I think it's Dan Curtis's Barnabas Collins, and it's Dan Curtis's adaptation of Dracula with Jack Palance.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I think those are the 2 that really go headlong with this whole lost love thing, which, as you talk about early in your book, even you're talking about Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, the film with Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman as Dracula. I love his performance, by the way. And there, yes. Go ahead, you know where I'm going with this in that film, the cinematograph there in that film.
Oh yeah. Well, it speaks directly to silent cinema when Count Dracula and Mina visit a cinematograph in the late 19th century, just as Shadow of the Vampire does when Count Orlok actually looks into a projector, and it's projecting its light onto his eyes as he's mesmerized by the technology of cinema. But I think you're correct about the romantic vampire, and I think the very tagline of Coppola's film was "Love Never Dies." That romantic sensibility that we get with Barnabas Collins and of course so many others.
Yeah, I think it really starts with Dan Curtis, with Barnabas and Josette, and is it Richard Matheson? I forget who did the teleplay for the Jack Palance that Curtis produced, but it is exactly that thing, that Mina is a lost love, a reincarnation.
Yes, which comes back in the Coppola, but of course this isn't there in Stoker.
Not at all.
Not at all. I mean, in Stoker, it's much more bloodlust / lust rather than love, let alone lost love.
Absolutely. So prior to Barnabas Collins, I think we've projected a lot of that strange romanticism on the vampires played by Bela Lugosi, by Christopher Lee.
Yes.
So, Well, Gary, this has been marvelous, and I hope I haven't done too much talking. I get excited about. I can talk about.
Well, I get too excited as well, but it's of all people to talk to, I rarely enjoy talking to anybody as much as I do yourself. So it's been awfully kind of you to ask me to be on the show, and I'm very, very grateful.
Well, I love this book as I love all of your books, and we will be talking very, very soon, because I do want to. I really want to talk to you when we release the audio book of Off, to your novel, and give that a boost. And then we'll figure out something else to talk about, because there's lots. And you're working
wonderful!
On
there's always something to talk about, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Absolutely. So Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Have a wonderful evening.
Well, thank you very, very much for listening. We hope you're enjoying our podcasts, and we hope that you've subscribed. We have so many different things coming up. We have more interviews with creators. We have some audio essays. I'm beginning a monthly series called An Actor's Notebook, which I've been writing for a long time, and I'm very anxious to share it with you. And we have some audio drama. Soon, the Midnight Matinee, our horror anthology series, will resume. So again, thank you for listening to the Redfield Arts audio podcast. Always the human voice, never AI, if there is such a thing. Thank you for listening. Until next time, this is Mark Redfield.